husband's funeral, Evelyn heard a woman call out two names, Chloe, Noah. And in that moment, her entire body went cold. Because those weren't just random names. Those were the exact names her husband had chosen for their unborn children. The same names written on the two houses she paid for. And standing right in front of her were the children who already had them. Evelyn didn't react immediately, not because she didn't understand what she heard, but because her mind refused to process it. Grief already had a tight grip on her chest, and now something darker was slowly pushing its way in. She turned slightly, just enough to see them clearly. A boy and a girl standing close to a woman she had never seen before. And for the first time since her husband died, Evelyn felt something colder than grief. Something was wrong. And deep down, she already knew. This funeral was only the beginning. Evelyn Carter had always been a woman people respected. She was composed, financially secure, and known for building her life with intention. In her late 40s, she had everything many people spent a lifetime chasing: successful investments, multiple properties, and a reputation for making smart, calculated decisions. But there was one thing she didn't have, and that was the one thing she wanted most: a child. Her marriage to Richard Carter had started later in life. It wasn't rushed and it wasn't careless. They met through mutual friends, built a steady connection, and eventually created what looked like a solid, peaceful life together. Richard was charming in a quiet way. Not overly loud, not overly ambitious, but attentive enough to make Evelyn feel safe. And then for a long time that was enough, until the silence in their home started to feel louder than everything else. They tried for years, quietly at first, then with growing urgency. Doctor visits became routine. Specialist consultations replaced weekend plans. Conversations about investments slowly turned into conversations about fertility timelines, test results, and possibilities that never seemed to arrive. Evelyn carried most of the emotional weight. She blamed herself in ways she never said out loud. Richard, on the other hand, always appeared calm, supportive, patient. He held her when she cried, reassured her when she felt broken, and constantly reminded her that their story wasn't over yet. He had a way of speaking that made things sound certain, even when they weren't. And that certainty became something Evelyn leaned on more than she realized. Because when hope starts fading, even borrowed confidence can feel like something to hold on to. But what Evelyn didn't know was that Richard's certainty wasn't coming from faith. It was coming from something else entirely. It started one quiet evening on their balcony, the kind of evening where the air felt still and conversations became softer. Evelyn had just returned from another appointment, another conversation that ended with, "We'll keep trying." She looked exhausted, emotionally drained in a way that no amount of rest could fix. Richard sat beside her, unusually thoughtful. Then he said something that shifted everything. He told her he could already picture their children, not in a vague, hopeful way, but in detail. He described a boy, calm, intelligent, grounded. Then he said the name felt right: Noah. Then he described a girl, gentle, warm, full of light: Chloe. He didn't hesitate when he said the names, and somehow that made them feel real. Evelyn smiled for the first time that day. What she didn't realize was that those names were not coming from imagination. From that moment, something changed in Evelyn. The names gave her something to hold on to. They turned uncertainty into something that felt almost tangible. She started imagining birthdays, school mornings, family dinners. She could see their future in a way she hadn't been able to before, and Richard encouraged it. He repeated the names often, not in a forced way, but casually, naturally, like they already belonged to their lives. He would say things like, "When Noah gets older," or "Chloe's going to love this place one day." It felt comforting. It felt intentional. It felt like they were finally moving forward. Then one night, Richard introduced an idea that sounded responsible, even wise. He suggested they start preparing for their children's future now, and that was the moment the real plan began. He framed it as vision, as a legacy, as something smart parents do ahead of time. He talked about how most people wait too long to secure their children's future, and how they had the opportunity to do things differently. Then he said it clearly: they should buy two properties, one for Noah one for Chloe. Evelyn didn't agree immediately, not because she couldn't afford it, but because something about buying property in the names of children who didn't exist yet felt unusual. Richard was ready for that hesitation. He told her it was an act of faith, that they needed to start living like people who believed their prayers were already answered, that speaking things into existence required action. And slowly, her doubt turned into belief. Because when hope is fragile, conviction can be very persuasive. Within months, the properties were purchased. Two beautiful homes in developing neighborhoods with high future value. Smart investments by any standard. But what made them special to Evelyn was not their location or price. It was the names on the documents. Noah Carter, Chloe Carter. Each one carried Richard's surname. Each one felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Evelyn remembered holding those papers and feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She believed she was building something real, something meaningful, something that would one day belong to the children she hadn't met yet. Richard handled most of the final paperwork. He said it was safer that way. He preferred to keep important documents secure, organized, and out of reach from unnecessary risk. Evelyn didn't question it. She trusted him completely, and that trust would become the most expensive mistake of her life. At the funeral, Evelyn watched the children again, this time more carefully. The boy stood quietly, observant, holding himself in a way that felt strangely familiar. The girl leaned into the woman beside her, wiping tears with small, restless hands. They didn't look like strangers. They looked like they belonged, and that realization sent a sharp wave of unease through her chest. Because if they belonged, then where had they been all this time? And more importantly, why had she never heard about them? Evelyn didn't move closer. She didn't speak. She simply observed, because something told her that whatever truth was hiding here would not reveal itself gently, and she was right. Because before that day ended, someone was going to say something that would change everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Evelyn didn't confront anyone at the funeral, not immediately. She had learned over the years that reacting too quickly often meant missing important details, and right now details were everything. So she watched. She watched who spoke to the woman, who avoided her, who seemed uncomfortable when Evelyn's eyes lingered too long in their direction. There were glances, quick, subtle, almost guilty. Conversations that stopped when she came too close. A kind of quiet tension moving through people who were trying very hard to appear normal. And that was when Evelyn understood something that made her stomach tighten. This wasn't new information. Not to them. She wasn't discovering something hidden. She was discovering something that had been kept from her. And the deeper that realization settled in, the more she began to feel like a stranger in her own life. That night, after most of the guests had left and the house had fallen into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, Evelyn made a decision. She wasn't going to sleep without answers. She called Richard's younger sister into one of the private rooms and closed the door behind them. There was no anger in Evelyn's voice, no raised tone, no accusations, just one question. Who are those children? The silence that followed felt longer than it actually was. But in that silence, Evelyn saw everything she needed to see. The hesitation, the fear, the way the sister's eyes shifted, searching for an answer that didn't exist. Then the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And in that moment, Evelyn knew the truth was worse than she imagined. Richard's sister didn't deny it. She couldn't. The weight of the moment was too heavy, and the truth had already started leaking through in too many directions. She admitted it slowly, carefully, as if each word carried its own consequence. Richard had another family, not recently, not briefly, for years. The woman Evelyn saw at the funeral wasn't a stranger. She was someone Richard had been involved with long before certain parts of his marriage even began to struggle. And the children, Chloe and Noah, were his. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She didn't cry. She didn't react the way most people expected someone in her position to react. She just sat there, still, silent, listening, because her mind had moved past shock and was now searching for something much more specific. When were they born? That was the only question she asked next, and the answer changed everything. Before the properties, before the conversations about future children, before the names were ever introduced to her as something hopeful. Chloe and Noah had already been alive, already growing, already existing somewhere outside the life Evelyn believed she was building. That was when the full weight of the deception finally settled in. Richard hadn't just been unfaithful. He hadn't just hidden children. He had taken something deeply personal, something vulnerable, and used it with intention. Because those names were never dreams. They were already real. The room felt smaller after that, like the walls had moved closer without warning. Evelyn stood up slowly, not because she felt weak, but because sitting there any longer felt unbearable. She walked to the window, looking out into the dark, trying to steady her breathing. And then, almost to herself, she asked a question that revealed just how far her mind had already gone. The houses. Richard's sister didn't respond immediately, but she didn't need to, because silence once again was enough. Evelyn turned back slowly. Oh, those houses. Were they for them? This time the answer came with tears. Yes. And just like that, everything made sense in the worst possible way. Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't break down. She didn't collapse under the weight of what she had just heard. Instead, something inside her went completely still. Because what she was dealing with now was no longer just betrayal. It was calculation. Richard had known exactly what he was doing. From the moment he introduced those names to the way he spoke about the future, to the timing of the property purchases, none of it was random. It was structured, planned, carefully executed. He had taken her desire to become a mother and built a strategy around it. And the most painful part of all was realizing how easily she had believed him. For the first time that night, Evelyn allowed herself to sit down again. But this time, it wasn't out of calm. It was because her legs no longer felt steady under the weight of everything she was processing. Richard's sister continued speaking, almost as if she needed to release everything at once before losing the courage to do so. She explained that Richard had always intended to secure something for the children, that he felt responsible for them, that he wanted to make sure they had a stable future. But he didn't have the financial capacity to do it on his own. So he found another way, a way that didn't require him to ask for help directly, a way that allowed him to get exactly what he wanted, without ever telling the truth. And Evelyn had unknowingly made it all possible. Every memory started to shift. The balcony conversation, the way he said the names so confidently, the emotional reassurance, the talk about faith and preparation. It all sounded different now. What once felt like love now felt like manipulation. What once felt like hope now felt like strategy. Evelyn realized something that made her chest tighten again, this time with a different kind of pain. Richard had never been imagining a future with her. He had been planning a future for someone else, using her resources to build it, and she had stood beside him the entire time, believing she was part of that future. But there was still something she didn't know, something that would take this from emotional betrayal to something much deeper, much more permanent. Evelyn stood up again, her mind now sharper, more focused than it had been all day. She looked directly at Richard's sister and asked one final question. Where are the documents? This time, the silence felt different, not hesitant, not emotional, but final. And in that moment, Evelyn knew whatever answer came next was going to be worse than everything she had already heard. The silence after Evelyn's question stretched just long enough to confirm what she already feared. Richard's sister lowered her gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to find the right words. But there were no right words for something like this. He already gave them the documents. The sentence landed slowly, too slowly. Evelyn didn't react immediately. Her mind repeated the words, trying to make sense of them, trying to reshape them into something less devastating. But there was no softer version of that truth. Before he died? She asked quietly. A small nod. Yes. And just like that, the betrayal moved from something emotional to something final. Evelyn turned away, her thoughts racing in a way that felt almost mechanical. This wasn't just deception anymore. It wasn't just about hidden children or broken trust. This was planned, every step of it. Richard hadn't just convinced her to buy those properties. He had positioned himself to control them, to hold the documents, to decide when and where they would go. And he had done exactly that, quietly, carefully, completely. Before his death, he had made sure everything was already in motion. That meant there was no confrontation, no explanation, no chance for her to demand answers. He had left her with the truth, but taken the opportunity to defend himself with him. And Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not a breakdown, not panic, something colder, more controlled, because grief had kept her still until now. But this was different. This was something she could not afford to process emotionally alone. She needed clarity, facts, proof, and most importantly, control. Without another word, she walked out of the room, leaving Richard's sister behind. The hallway felt quieter than before, as if the entire house was holding its breath. For the first time since the funeral began, Evelyn wasn't thinking like a widow anymore. She was thinking like someone who had just discovered she had been used. The next morning came without rest. Evelyn hadn't slept, but her mind was sharper than it had been in days. There was no confusion left, no denial, only one clear objective: find the truth in full. When she started where she believed the answers should be, Richard's office, it was exactly how he left it: organized, clean, every file in place, every drawer closed. At first glance, nothing looked out of order, but Evelyn knew better now. Appearances meant nothing. She opened the drawers one by one, scanning documents quickly, methodically: business records, old contracts, personal files, nothing connected to the properties. Then she moved to the locked cabinet. It took time, but eventually she got it open. Still nothing. And that was when the reality began to settle in. This wasn't an oversight. This was intentional. Evelyn checked everywhere: the home office, the bedroom drawers, storage boxes, even places that didn't seem logical. Nothing. No original property documents, no copies, no evidence of ownership within her reach. And with every empty space she searched, the truth became heavier. Richard hadn't just taken control of the documents. He had removed every trace of them from her life. That meant one thing: he had planned for this outcome, not just the transfer, but the aftermath. He had made sure that when the truth finally surfaced, she would be left with nothing but questions. And that realization was more disturbing than anything she had discovered so far. Evelyn stopped searching, not because she was tired, but because she understood something critical. This wasn't going to be solved inside that house. The answers were no longer where she lived. They were where Richard had been living his other life. And if she wanted the truth, she would have to go there. But before she could make that move, she needed to understand something else. How many people knew? Because the silence at the funeral, the glances, the hesitation, that wasn't the behavior of people hearing shocking news for the first time. That was the behavior of people who had been keeping a secret. And if that was true, then Richard hadn't done this alone. By afternoon, Evelyn made a series of calls: careful ones, strategic ones, not emotional, not confrontational, just questions framed in a way that forced subtle honesty. And slowly, the truth started revealing itself in fragments. Some people knew about the other woman. Some knew about the children. A few even knew about the properties, though not the full details. But no one had ever told her, not directly, not clearly, because it was complicated, because it was not their place, because they didn't want to interfere. And as each explanation came in, Evelyn felt something inside her harden even further. This wasn't just Richard's betrayal anymore. This was a network of silence, and silence had protected him. For a brief moment, Evelyn allowed herself to feel it. The anger, not loud, not explosive, but deep, focused, controlled, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. Richard hadn't been lucky. He had been strategic. He had relied on her trust. He had relied on her vulnerability. And he had relied on the fact that no one would speak up. And for years, he had been right, but not anymore. because now the truth was no longer hidden. And once truth surfaces, it changes everything. That evening, Evelyn sat alone in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. The house felt unfamiliar now, like it belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed. Every corner held a memory that now felt altered. Every conversation replayed differently in her mind. And beneath all of it, one question refused to leave her. Did he ever love her at all? Or had she simply been a means to an end? She didn't have the answer. And for the first time, she realized she might never get one, because the only person who could explain everything was gone. But even without answers, Evelyn knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because what Richard had taken from her wasn't just emotional. It was tangible. It was measurable. And somewhere out there were two properties she had paid for, now sitting in the hands of children she had never met. Children who carried the names she once believed belonged to her future. And that was something she could not ignore. Evelyn stood up slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, because something inside her had finally settled into place. Grief had done its part. Shock had passed. Now, something else was taking over. Something stronger, more deliberate, more dangerous. Because Evelyn was no longer trying to understand what happened. She already knew. Now she was going to find out what could still be taken back. The next few days were different. Not quieter, not easier, but clearer. Evelyn no longer moved through her home like someone lost. Every step she took now had direction. Every thought had purpose. The confusion that once clouded her mind had been replaced by something far more precise. Clarity. One, because once the truth fully reveals itself, there is no space left for illusion. She wasn't asking questions anymore. She was preparing for action. And the first thing she understood was this. If Richard had planned everything this carefully, then undoing it would require more than emotion. It would require strategy. Evelyn reached out to a lawyer the following morning. Not someone familiar, not someone connected to family, someone neutral, sharp, experienced in property disputes and financial deception. She didn't soften the story. She didn't leave anything out. She explained everything exactly as it happened. The marriage, the infertility, the names, the properties, the documents, the discovery at the funeral. And when she finished speaking, there was a brief silence on the other end of the call. Then the lawyer said something that shifted the entire direction of her thoughts. This isn't just betrayal. This may be fraud. And for the first time since Richard's death, Evelyn felt something that wasn't pain. It was possibility. The process wasn't simple. Nothing about it was, because the situation sat in a complicated space between emotion and law. The properties had been purchased under names tied to the children, but the funds had come from Evelyn. The intent behind the purchases had been misrepresented, which meant everything came down to one question. What had Evelyn been led to believe? Because if those purchases were made under false pretenses, then the foundation of the entire arrangement could be challenged. And that was where things began to shift, because for the first time, the truth wasn't just something painful. It was something useful. The investigation moved slowly. Records were pulled, transactions reviewed, communication trails examined. Every detail mattered now. Evelyn found herself revisiting moments she once ignored, emails, conversations, decisions she had made without hesitation. And as everything came together, a pattern became impossible to deny. Richard hadn't acted impulsively. He had constructed this, step by step, carefully aligning every decision to lead to the same outcome. And that realization didn't break Evelyn. It strengthened her. Because if something was built intentionally, then it could be taken apart intentionally too. Outside the legal process, life continued, but not in the same way. People still talked, some quietly, some openly. The story had spread far beyond what Evelyn expected. Different versions, near different angles, different opinions, some sympathetic, some judgmental. There were those who said she should have seen the signs, those who suggested she had been too trusting, and those who simply watched, waiting to see how it would all end. But Evelyn stopped listening because she understood something most people never do. When you've been betrayed at that level, public opinion becomes irrelevant. Only truth matters. One evening, she found herself back on the balcony, the same place where everything had started, the same quiet air, the same stillness, but nothing else felt the same. She stood there for a long time, looking out into the distance, letting the silence settle around her. And for the first time, she allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding. Did he ever love me? The answer didn't come, not clearly. Because love, when mixed with manipulation, becomes difficult to define. But after a while, Evelyn realized something important. That question no longer mattered, because whether Richard loved her or not, his actions had already given her the truth she needed. Love does not deceive with intention. Love does not study your pain and turn it into opportunity. Love does not build a future for someone else, using your trust as the foundation. And once she accepted that, something inside her finally settled. Not closure, but clarity. And clarity is what allows a person to move forward without looking back. The legal battle continued for months. Some parts moved in her favor. Others became complicated. Certain details remained tangled in technicalities that only time could resolve. But Evelyn was no longer chasing a perfect outcome. When she wasn't trying to erase what had happened, she was establishing something else entirely: control. Because for years, decisions had been made around her without her knowledge. Now, every step forward was hers. The children remained where they were. Their lives continued, separate from hers. And for a long time, Evelyn struggled with how to feel about that, because they were not responsible for what had been done. They were part of the outcome, but not the cause. And that understanding brought a different kind of peace. Not forgiveness, but acceptance. Because some situations don't have clean endings, only clear truths. Months later, Evelyn's life began to take on a different rhythm. Quieter, more intentional. Less distracted by what could not be changed. She focused on her work again, her space, her decisions. But she was not the same woman she had been before. Because once a person sees that level of truth, they don't return to who they used to be. They become more aware, more observant, more selective about what they believe, and who they trust. Looking back, the most painful part of everything was not the secret family. It wasn't even the properties. It was the realization that the life she thought she was building had never existed in the way she believed. And yet, that truth didn't destroy her. It revealed her, because what remained after everything collapsed was still strong, still capable, still in control. At her husband's funeral, Evelyn arrived as a grieving wife. But by the time she left, she had become something else entirely. A woman who had seen through a carefully constructed life and lived to tell the truth behind it. Because in the end, the most chilling part of her story wasn't just that her husband had another family. It was that the children she had been praying for had been alive all along, and the future she thought she was building had never been hers to begin with. And if this story left you thinking, I'd really like to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are. Stories like this remind us how much people can hide, even in the closest relationships. So if you felt something while listening, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Because you never really know what's happening behind the life someone shows you.